The stars stretched out like a canvas of frozen diamonds, each point of light a secret untold, a beacon calling to the curious and the daring. Human curiosity had long since surpassed the boundaries of Earth, reaching out with fingers of metal and ambition, striving to touch the void. But nothing had prepared humanity for the discovery they made on the edge of the Andromeda expanse. The starship Endurance cut through the inky sea of space, a speck of silver against an endless dark. It was a marvel of human engineering, sleek and efficient, its frame forged from alloys that could withstand the fiery embrace of a star. Crew members bustled about, voices humbling their ambition into quiet murmurings. Their mission was simple, yet impossible: to find signs of life, to touch the unknown and return with proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. Dr. Elara Quinn, a brilliant but disillusioned xenobiologist, stared out the viewport. Her dark eyes, the color of black holes' event horizon, flickered with both excitement and exhaustion. The star field shimmered with an intensity that defied belief, and it was then that the sensors blared a warning. An anomaly, its signal pulsing in the cosmic silence, had been detected. "Captain, you need to see this." Elara's voice broke through the chatter on the bridge, sharp and insistent. Captain Marcus Hale, a towering figure with an imposing frame and a voice that could command armies, took the call from his station. His eyes were as sharp as his reputation, but there was an undercurrent of weariness that only years of command could breed. "Elara, what is it?" "It's impossible," she replied, scanning the data. The anomaly appeared on their screen, a formation of colossal shapes, massive and ancient, floating in the vacuum as though suspended by the hand of a god. The ship's crew peered at the image, murmurs of disbelief rolling through them. The formations were enormous, half obscured by the shifting plasma clouds that surrounded them, yet their outlines were unmistakable. They were ships, but not like anything humanity had ever built. These were the ships of an ancient fleet, not designed with technology that bore any resemblance to humanity's own. They were more magnificent, more terrifying, a ballet of ancient elegance and alien cunning. "It's the fleet of the Progenitors," Elara whispered, stunned. The Progenitors were nothing more than a legend, a myth whispered among those who were daring enough to read the old, forbidden star charts. Tales spoke of a race so advanced they built worlds, so clever they could leave behind blueprints for life itself. But they vanished long before humans had even discovered fire. The crew of the Endurance struggled to absorb the sight. To them, it was like looking at the gods' own abandoned temple, too profound to be real. "This is impossible," murmured Lieutenant Saeed, glancing at Captain Hale. His tone was a mixture of awe and skepticism. Captain Hale stood in silence, eyes locked on the images. Memories of Earth's stubborn history played before him. The cries of scientists laughed at by their peers, inventions ridiculed until they became everyday miracles. This was something different, a galaxy shaking different. And then it happened. The ancient ship stirred. The stillness shattered as one of the colossal vessels activated, its alien engine humming with a sound so deep that it vibrated through the Endurance itself. Crew members recoiled, eyes wide with the sort of fear that only comes from understanding that their existence is not the pinnacle of progress. The ship flared to life, sending ripples through the cosmic dark. "What is it doing?" Elara gasped, her hands trembling. A voice, deep and mechanical, resonated in the ship's communication system. It spoke in a language older than time, translated in real time by the ship's AI, which had never before deciphered anything even close. "The fleet has awakened. The architects return." The implications were staggering. They were not just relics of a lost civilization. They were a warning, an invitation, an indication that humanity had stumbled upon something far greater than they ever imagined. Something the Progenitors had left behind as a test or as a last defense against those who dared to reach for the stars. In the mess hall, whispers turned to debates and debates to panic. The galaxy's first unified understanding was fractured. The human race was not the apex intelligence. There were ancient secrets woven into the very fabric of existence that humanity had dared to laugh at, assuming themselves as the most enlightened beings in the cosmos. But as the Endurance shifted into a course set for the fleet, It was Elara who stepped forward, the first to comprehend what was at stake. The fleet had not stirred to announce the end of humanity, but to challenge it. It was an intelligence test, a riddle coded in starlight. "They're waiting for us," she said, the challenge igniting in her eyes like a flame. "They're waiting for humanity's genius to answer." A surge of determination swept through the crew as the captain's voice, steady and unwavering, rang out through the comms. "Then let us show them what we can do." And so, humanity's laughter, once filled with hubris and doubt, was silenced by a resolve born not of fear, but of the realization that they were only beginning to reach the heights they were meant to conquer. The ancient fleet would soon learn that humanity's genius had only just begun to shatter their doubts. As the Endurance set its course, the stars around them seemed to glow brighter, as if in anticipation, as if to say that the story of mankind was about to enter a chapter no one could have predicted. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Architects. The Endurance glided through the cosmic sea, its engines humming with a low, rhythmic pulse that resonated through the hearts of the crew. The ancient fleet loomed ahead, colossal and haunting, yet undeniably majestic. A silence had gripped the ship, its occupants speaking only in hushed tones, as if the very stars themselves were holding their breath. Elara Quinn sat at her console, eyes scanning the stream of data the fleet was transmitting. It was a language more intricate than any she had encountered, one that defied the boundaries of logic. Glyphs formed and reformed on her screen, pulsing like a heartbeat. The ship's AI, an entity named Thales, was attempting to decode it but struggled against the complexity. "Dr. Quinn, can you make sense of it?" Marcus Hale's voice crackled through the comms, firm but tinged with anxiety. Elara hesitated, then glanced up at the captain. His face was etched with both determination and the kind of dread that comes with facing the unknown. "It's not just a language, Marcus. It's a test, a riddle designed to challenge. But I think we're close." "How close?" Elara's fingers hovered over the holographic keys as the glyphs shifted and morphed before her. Patterns emerged, complex structures that seemed to interlock and interweave with ascension awareness. "A few minutes, maybe. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The words sparked a ripple of nervous energy among the crew. Lieutenant Saeed, always the skeptic, fidgeted at his console. "Prepared for what? We don't even know what we're dealing with." Before anyone could respond, the ship's AI, Thales, spoke, its mechanical voice reverberating with a tone of urgency. "Incoming transmission. Decoding completed." The holographic display flared with light as the glyphs arranged into a coherent message. Each character seemed to glow, as though imbued with its own life. "Test of the Architects. Awakening begins. Prove your worth or be cast into silence." A deep, resonant vibration swept through the ship as if an unseen hand had placed its palm on the hull, pressing it into the void. Crew members gripped their stations, the fear in their eyes mirroring the echoes of a truth long buried. Humanity was not the pinnacle of creation. The Progenitors had designed a test, one that stretched across millennia, one that was meant to judge. Captain Hale met Elara's eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Humanity had always believed itself to be clever, quick to adapt, quick to learn. But this was more than adaptation. This was an invitation to redefine their place in the universe. "Dr. Quinn, I need options. What do we have?" Hale's voice, a steady anchor in the storm, cut through the confusion. Elara's eyes darted to the display, calculating. The fleet is asking for something more than words. It's asking for an answer, a demonstration of intelligence, creativity, adaptability, something that can prove humanity's value. A pause. The crew looked at each other, breaths caught in their throats. "A challenge," said Lieutenant Saeed, the realization seeping into his voice. "An intellectual duel. A riddle that has to be solved or what?" Elara asked, a shiver running down her spine. Before the question could be answered, the ship shuddered again, this time more violently. The lights flickered, and the bridge was bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The fleet in front of them began to shift, plates and panels folding inward like an ancient flower awakening to the touch of dawn. The transmission came again, the voice echoing with the weight of centuries. "The first test. the labyrinth of logic. Solve it or witness silence. Elara's heart pounded. Before her, a new pattern appeared on the screen, an intricate maze of light and shadow, shifting in ways that defied normal spatial reasoning. It was no ordinary maze. It was an enigma wrapped in symbols that spoke of higher mathematics, fractals within fractals. The deeper one looked, the more the design seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The crew murmured, awestruck and terrified. The captain, eyes narrowed, stepped forward. Elara, you've said humanity is capable of genius. Show them. Elara took a deep breath, fingers flying across her console. This was more than a test. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. If humanity failed, the progenitors would mark them as a civilization unworthy, a species destined for irrelevance. But if they succeeded, a voice from the back of the room broke through her focus. It was Saeed, and his voice was unmistakably triumphant. It's a mathematical riddle based on the Fibonacci sequence and hypergeometric progressions. It's not just a labyrinth, it's a coded map. Elara's eyes snapped to his. A spark of hope ignited within her. The sequence will guide us through. The bridge turned into a dance of light and mathematics. The crew members working together as Elara input calculations, feeding them to the ship's AI. Numbers flowed across the screen in streams of logic that became ever more complex, ever more daring. The maze responded, shifting its paths and boundaries, but the crew pressed on, following the sequence, solving each layer with a mix of calculated precision and creative intuition. The pressure was a storm that clawed at their nerves, yet humanity's response was one of unyielding resolve. Suddenly, the maze's center illuminated, forming a symbol that sent a shiver down Elara's spine. It was a glyph, but not just any glyph. It was the emblem of the progenitors. The fleet's ships stopped shifting, and the air was thick with the weight of anticipation. You have passed the first test, the voice declared, its tone shifting from threat to recognition. The architects acknowledge your ingenuity. Proceed. A cheer erupted on the bridge, a sound so rare and beautiful it could have been mistaken for the song of the stars. But Elara knew the journey was far from over. This was only the beginning. The fleet had awakened, and humanity's genius had shattered its doubts. But what other tests lay ahead? And would humanity's brilliance be enough to face the architect's true trials? Only time would tell. Chapter 3. The second trial, Shadows of the Mind. The mood on the Endurance was electric. Elara Quinn leaned against the console, the hum of the ship's engines beneath her a comforting reminder of their continued existence. For a brief moment, humanity had proven itself, showing that even against cosmic odds, they could challenge the legacy of the progenitors. But victory was fleeting. The voice of the fleet, deep and resonant, whispered through the ship's comms again, breaking the brief silence that followed their triumph. The second trial, the shadows of the mind. Only those who face themselves in the dark may advance. Elara felt her pulse quicken, the thin, metallic taste of dread creeping up her throat. The rest of the crew exchanged glances, confusion and fear mirrored in their eyes. Captain Hale stood at the helm, his face set with the grim resolve of a leader who knew that the hardest battles were often fought within. Shadows of the mind, Elara repeated, the words tasting foreign as they left her lips. She turned to the AI, Thales, and met its mechanical gaze on the holographic screen. What do we know? The AI flickered and shifted, a swirl of data streaming across the display. The trial is designed to test the inner strength of those who face it. Participants must confront their deepest fears, regrets, and doubts. Failure will lead to mental disintegration, a loss of self. The trial is psychological, not physical. A shiver ran through Elara's spine. This wasn't a challenge of intellect or knowledge, but of the spirit, of the ability to navigate the labyrinths of one's own mind and confront the shadows lurking there. It was a test she had never imagined could exist, let alone one that humanity might be subjected to. Captain, we need to prepare, Elara said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. This will require more than strategy. We need to be ready to face whatever it is that we fear most. Hale nodded, his jaw tightening. Gather the crew in the briefing room. We need to understand what we're up against before we proceed. The briefing room, usually a place of strategy and calculation, felt like a chamber of foreboding as the crew gathered. The lights were dimmed, casting long, stretched shadows across their faces. Each crew member seemed older, weighed down by the gravity of what lay ahead. Elara's eyes scanned the room, settling on Lieutenant Saeed, whose eyes were wide and haunted with a kind of anxiety she had never seen before. Captain Hale stood at the center, his voice breaking the silence. We are about to face the second trial, which will test us not with logic or knowledge, but with who we are at our core. The shadows of the mind are different for each of us. They will take the shape of our deepest fears, regrets, or lost hopes. I need each of you to be prepared to confront your own inner darkness. A collective shudder swept through the crew. Elara's own mind raced with possibilities. What would she see? The shadow of her late brother, whose life had been stolen by a war she had failed to prevent. The fear that her pursuit of the unknown had always been an escape from her own inadequacies. The voice of Thales returned, its calm, unfeeling presence a strange comfort. The trial will begin in 5 minutes. Participants will be connected to a neural interface that will project their deepest psychological fears into a shared, virtual landscape. The trial is immersive and will last until the participant either overcomes their fear or succumbs to it. The room went silent. Only the steady breathing of the crew filled the void, punctuated by the occasional nervous cough. "We can do this," Captain Hale said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We have to." Elara clenched her jaw and stepped forward. "I'll go first." A few murmurs of concern flared around her, but she held up her hand. "I need to understand what we're facing before anyone else steps in. We'll need to see how this works so we can support one another." Hale nodded reluctantly, stepping aside as she approached the neural interface. The device, sleek and almost beautiful in its simplicity, glowed with an eerie blue light. "Remember," Elara whispered, turning to the crew, "we are more than what haunts us." The instant the interface connected, Elara's vision blurred, and her surroundings dissolved into a landscape of black fog. A chill seeped through her, and she shivered, the silence pressing against her ears like an iron band. The world around her warped, and she found herself standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking an abyss that stretched endlessly downward. The wind howled, carrying a voice she knew too well. Elara, her brother Callum, stood at the center of the chasm, the wind tugging at his tattered clothes. His eyes, the same dark eyes that had once brought comfort, now glistened with a mix of reproach and anger. "You left me." The air seemed to crackle, a weight that threatened to suffocate her. Elara's heart pounded as she reached out to him, but his face twisted into something unrecognizable, a grotesque mask of accusations and blame. The world shifted, and she found herself back in the ruins of a shattered city, fire and smoke coiling around her like serpents. "You never did enough," a voice whispered, familiar and sharp. The city crumbled, walls collapsing in a deafening roar, echoing her failure to protect those she loved. Elara stumbled backward, eyes wide with horror. The city transformed into the cold, sterile halls of the Endurance, filled with figures of the crew she knew but didn't recognize. Twisted shadows, faceless and blank-eyed, watching her with the same suffocating expectation. They pointed and whispered, but no sound escaped their lips. The fear was suffocating, drowning her in guilt and regret. The shadows began to move, closer and closer, until they engulfed her, pressing on her chest like 100 unseen hands. "This is not who you are," she whispered to herself, trying to remember the courage that had carried her this far. "I am more than this." With a surge of determination, Elara took a deep breath, pushing back the darkness with the power of her will. The shadows shuddered, faltered, and then began to melt away, the chasm crumbling into the light of a bright, sunrise-colored horizon. Callum's figure, now translucent and gentle, looked at her with a nod of understanding before fading into the glow. Elara's eyes snapped open, the neural interface humming as the illusion dissolved. She gasped for air, her body trembling from the rawness of the experience. Captain Hale was there, hand on her shoulder, his face both relieved and worried. "Are you all right?" Elara nodded, tears in her eyes, but a smile breaking through. "I passed. And now, we know what we're up against." A flicker of hope spread through the crew as they realized it was possible to face the shadows, to confront what haunted them, and survive. But as they readied for the next trial, a dark realization took root. The shadows of the mind had only been the beginning. The progenitors had tested them, and they had fought back, but there were still trials to come, each one more dangerous and cunning than the last. And they would need every ounce of their collective courage, intellect, and humanity to face what lay ahead. The architects were watching. The air on the Endurance was heavy, a tension that clawed at the crew's throats and weighed on their chests. Elara Quinn sat at her station, the memory of the shadows of the mind still fresh and raw. She was no longer the same, yet she carried on, determined. Captain Hale's words echoed in her mind. "We are more than what haunts us." The crew had gathered again in the briefing room, their faces tired and marked by the battles of their pasts. Lieutenant Saeed looked less like the hard-edged skeptic and more like someone who had seen the void and lived to tell the tale. Even his usual confidence was tempered by a new wariness. Captain Hale addressed the crew, his voice calm but resolute. "We've proven that we can face the deepest, darkest corners of our minds and emerge stronger. But the architects are not finished. The next trial is upon us, and it is the most insidious one yet." Elara's pulse quickened. The crew listened intently, some shifting nervously as Hale continued. "The trial of reflections," he said, and a ripple of confusion passed through the room. "In this trial, we will face not our fears but our desires, our ambitions. It will show us what we most wish for, but also what we must sacrifice to achieve it. Only by understanding this truth can we proceed." The room fell silent, the weight of the captain's words pressing down on everyone. Elara thought of her brother, Callum, and the day he had died, the day she had failed him. In the trial of reflections, would she see a world where he never died, where she had kept her promises and saved those she loved? Would she be faced with the cost of that dream? "We will go in pairs," Hale said, breaking the silence. "Not alone, but with someone who will remind you of who you are and what's truly important." The crew exchanged glances, fear and anticipation tangled in their expressions. Elara's gaze met Saeed's, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the shadow of his former skepticism replaced with something softer, a question and an understanding. "I'll go with you," he said quietly. Elara nodded. They would need each other. The interface was set up in a private chamber, away from the main console. It looked like a sphere, its surface smooth and black, almost absorbing the light around it. When Elara and Saeed connected, the chamber filled with a gentle hum that grew into a low, resonating thrum. The air seemed to shimmer, and then, with a soft pulse, the world shifted. Elara found herself standing in a lush, green field, a place she'd never seen before. The sky above was a gradient of warm amber and soft purple, and the scent of wildflowers filled her lungs. She turned to see Saeed beside her, eyes wide with wonder. "Where are we?" he whispered. "I don't know," Elara said, but as she spoke, the scene around her began to shift and melt, revealing a future that made her heart stutter. They stood in the garden of her childhood home, the place where she and Callum had spent their happiest days. In the distance, she could hear him laughing, a sound so pure it ached. He was older now, his smile the same, but with a maturity that spoke of a life lived with her. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Elara herself, dressed in a uniform of brilliant white, eyes full of pride and hope. "Is this," Saeed started, his voice trembling. Elara's throat was tight. "It's what I wanted most. A life where Callum never died, where I made things right." The vision shifted again, and the bright garden became a hall of stars. A crowd of people, thousands strong, were gathered in a colossal chamber. The air was electric, charged with an energy that hummed through Elara's veins. At the center of the chamber was a throne, and upon it sat Elara, older, her eyes sharp with power and wisdom, but there was something hollow about her. "The price of power," Saeed whispered. "You would become a ruler, but at what cost?" Elara's chest tightened, the realization searing her heart. In this vision, she had gained everything she wanted, her brother's life, her ambition fulfilled, but she had lost her soul. The power she had craved had carved away the person she was meant to be. "This is what I must face," she said. "The part of me that would sacrifice everything for a dream." The image morphed again, this time into a room filled with shadows, each one reflecting parts of herself she had denied. A shadow of doubt that whispered she was unworthy. A shadow of arrogance that mocked her idealism. Each figure in the room wore her face, but spoke the language of her darkest instincts. "I am afraid," she whispered, the room echoing her voice. Saeed reached for her, his touch grounding. "Fear is not the enemy, Elara. It's what you do with it." The shadows shrieked, wailing in a chorus of denial. The vision darkened, the stars above vanishing into an abyss. The warmth of the garden was now replaced by an icy silence. Elara knew that if she wanted to move forward, she needed to embrace both her light and her dark, accept that desire was not without consequence, and that no dream was worth losing herself. The dark figures around her dissolved into stardust, a glimmer of understanding filling her eyes. She looked at Saeed, who nodded with a fierce smile, his voice a promise. "We passed the trial, Elara. We faced our reflections and chose who we are, not who we wish to be." Elara's breath came in ragged gasps as the chamber faded, leaving her standing once more in the sterile, dim-lit room of the Endurance. The neural interface released her, and she collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was over, but the lesson was branded into her very soul. The voice of the Progenitors, deep and almost reverent, spoke again. "The architects acknowledge your resolve. Proceed to the final trial." Captain Hale stepped forward, eyes on Elara, his expression unreadable but proud. The crew gathered around her, their faces set with a determination that mirrored her own. They were no longer just survivors. They were challengers, warriors against the dark, and they would fight until the stars burned out. But the final trial awaited, and whatever it was, they would face it together. The Endurance sat in the vast shadow of the ancient fleet, its metal shell glistening under the cosmos. The starry sea around them seemed to thrum, a silent heartbeat that pulsed with life. The crew had passed the trials of shadows and reflections, but there was a heaviness that clung to their spirits, as though they had only glimpsed what lay at the edge of their courage. The final trial loomed, a challenge that promised to test not just their minds, but their very essence as a people. Captain Hale stood at the bridge, looking out at the fleet with eyes that held both defiance and dread. Elara Quinn, now stronger and more resolute than ever, approached him, the memory of her last vision burning at the back of her mind. "Captain, we're ready," she said, though she couldn't shake the shiver that ran through her. Hale turned to her, his jaw set, eyes unwavering. "Ready for what, Elara?" "The trial of unity is the final reckoning. We either succeed as one or we face oblivion." Elara nodded. The message was clear. This trial was not about individuals. It was about them all, bound together. Unity wasn't just a word. It was an act, an understanding that they were stronger when they stood side by side. The voice of Thales, now more a companion than an AI, spoke through the bridge's intercom. "The trial of unity begins now. All participants must engage with the trial of concord, a mental construct where the mind of each crew member is linked. Each thought, each feeling, each fear will be laid bare. Only through true empathy and collective strength can you survive." Elara's breath caught. She knew this was not just a test of courage or intellect. It was a challenge to strip away every barrier and become something greater. The crew gathered in the command center, the air charged with anticipation. Saeed stood beside Elara, his expression unreadable. They were all connected now, the artificial neural interface placed on their temples. The room went dark, and the soft hum of the ship's core became a distant murmur. The world shifted. The crew stood on a barren plain, under a sky that swirled with storm clouds. The ground beneath them cracked with energy, and in the distance, a colossal figure emerged. It was the embodiment of their collective doubts, a monstrous creature with the faces of their deepest fears woven into its body. Its eyes were hollow, yet somehow aware. "You have come," it said, its voice an echo of 1,000 whispers. Elara felt Saeed's hand on her arm, grounding her in the shifting reality. It's a manifestation of our divisions, he said, voice firm. We need to confront it as one. The creature lunged forward, and the crew sprang into action, not as individuals, but as a singular force. Each of them saw the creatures and shadows within it, fears that had once been hidden, regrets they hadn't shared. Elara glimpsed the face of Callum, staring at her with eyes full of sadness. The doubts she had carried from the shadows of the mind came back to her, clawing at her resolve. Remember, Saeed shouted, his voice strong. It's not about facing this alone. It's about facing it together. Elara took a deep breath and felt the connection strengthen between them. Each crew member's consciousness intertwined, their thoughts and feelings overlapping like ripples on water. They became more than the sum of their parts. Fear was no longer an enemy. It was a shared truth, one that bound them, made them real. They reached out to each other, and the creature began to falter, its limbs shuddering as it tried to pull back, but there was nowhere to retreat. Elara saw faces light up with a newfound understanding. Marcus Hale, who had never let doubt take root, now shouted commands that lifted their collective resolve. Saeed, who had always questioned the unknown, stood tall with a newfound courage that radiated through the group. Each crew member was no longer an individual, but a part of an unbreakable chain, one that grew stronger with each heartbeat. We are not just human. We are humanity, Elara said aloud, and her voice was carried on the wind. The creature roared, a sound of defeat, as the storm clouds above split apart, revealing a sky awash in light. The monstrous form cracked and crumbled, shattering like glass. Where it had stood, a bridge appeared, radiant and leading into the heart of the fleet. The energy that once threatened to tear them apart was now their bond, a power that resonated with the pulse of the universe. You have passed the final trial, the voice of the Progenitors spoke, now filled with awe. The architects have found humanity worthy. The crew awoke on the Endurance, the neural interfaces dissolving as the room came back into focus. The silence that followed was a quiet testament to what they had just experienced. Captain Hale stepped forward, a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. We did it. We proved what we are capable of. Elara looked around at the crew, their faces flushed with the shared weight of victory and realization. They were no longer just explorers or survivors. They were a people united, not just in purpose but in spirit. The voice of Thales hummed with a note of reverence. The fleet is now yours to command, as is the legacy of the Progenitors. You have earned your place among the stars. As the stars outside shimmered in reply, Elara knew they were no longer alone. Humanity had passed the trials, shattered the doubts, and found their place in the cosmos, not as mere conquerors, but as stewards of something greater, unity, hope, and the boundless promise of the unknown. And in that moment, under the watchful light of distant stars, Elara Quinn and the crew of the Endurance looked to the future, ready to forge their path together.